the standard story that's usually told, the standard story certainly that I grew up with in college and as a graduate student, is not all there is to know, that things are a little more nuanced, a little more complex, a lot more complex. And what I've found, to make a very long story short, is that what's generally seen as the emergence of civilization about 5,000 years ago was really a re-emergence of civilization, and there was what I call a cycle of civilization and advanced societies back at the end of the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago, that was absolutely devastated by natural catastrophes at the time.
Revolution Radio proudly presents, live from the heart of the Blue Ridge, Roanoke, Virginia. It's the Just Bernard Show with host Bernard Alvarez. Join Bernard as he shares topics that reveal the real matrix and empower your human experience, including world liberty, the esoteric, suppressed technologies, spiritual ascension, and human consciousness. Humanity has awakened, and our time has come to realize our full potential. And now, live from the Star City, your host, Bernard Alvarez.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Just Bernard Show here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. We are also simulcasting live, hopefully, on facebook.com/Bernard Alex Alvarez. So without further ado, I've been looking forward to today's guest. Like I said, Robert Schoch has been on the show before. And he is, for those of you that may not know, let me tell you a little bit about Robert. He is a full-time faculty member at the College of General Studies at Boston University since 1984. He is a recipient of its Peyton Richter Award for Interdisciplinary Teaching, earned his PhD in Geology and Geophysics at Yale University in 1983. He holds an MS and MPhil in Geology and Geophysics from Yale, as well as degrees in Anthropology, Geology from George Washington University. In recognition of his research into ancient civilizations, Dr. Schoch was awarded in 2014 the title of Honorary Professor of the Nikolai Vapsterov Naval Academy in Varna, Bulgaria. In 2017, the College of General Studies at Boston University named him Director of its Institute for the Study of the Origins of Civilization. So we are going to have a very interesting hour with Dr. Robert Schoch. Welcome to the show, Robert. How are you today?
Oh, I'm very good. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you back. My goodness. So you are obviously a very busy man. You seem to have your studies and work in many different avenues that are of interest to myself and, well, to the world in general. I wonder if you could start off, Robert, by telling us a little bit about what got you started, what drew your interest to this type of work, and why did you fall in love with it and take it so personally to make it become such an importance in your life?
Well, I've always been interested in civilization, the origins of civilization, ancient civilizations. I remember, reading about the ancients and thinking about the ancients even when I was a young child. So it's really been a lifelong passion in that sense. Why, I don't exactly know. Why do any of us become interested in certain things? Probably partly because of my grandmother, who was interested in such things. But in many ways, I think that looking at past civilizations is really fundamental to being able to understand our own civilization and, where we're going. It sounds like a trite truism, but I think there's sort of a genuine aspect to it of knowing where we come from is to know where we're going, or at least to help chart our path where we're going. And something that I have found in my studies, much to my surprise actually, is that the standard story that's usually told, the standard story certainly that I grew up with in college and as a graduate student, is not all there is to know, that things are a little more nuanced, a little more complex, a lot more complex. And what I've found, to make a very long story short, is that what's generally seen as the emergence of civilization about 5,000 years ago was really a re-emergence of civilization, and there was what I call a cycle of civilization and advanced societies back at the end of the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago, that was absolutely devastated by natural catastrophes at the time. And civilization went into this long dark period, which I call SIDA, solar-induced dark age, because it was solar activity that devastated those early civilizations. And it took thousands and thousands of years before civilization reemerged. So this is a very different story than what is standardly taught to this day in the schools and in the textbooks. But I think it's correct based on the evidence, and it really expands on what we know, and it's actually a warning to us as we move forward.
Oh, I thank you so much for bringing that up, because that happens to be one of the reasons why I got involved doing the work that I do. It just seems that much of what we take to be common knowledge and common history it is, I don't want to say mainstream, but it's the accepted story, and we believe that story. And sometimes we don't look for the alternatives and or the addition of new information that comes to us is not necessarily added into that story. A great example, I guess, would be your work with the Sphinx and
exactly.
Your research there.
Yeah, because my Sphinx, and this is how I immediately got into this. This is I was working and I was working on and interested in ancient civilizations before I got involved with the Sphinx directly, but it's really the Sphinx that got me fully involved in such studies and ended up leading me to devote the vast majority of my research time to ancient studies. I would say virtually 100% of my research time is now devoted to ancient studies. And this began in the late 1980s. I was a fresh faculty member at Boston University, had just gotten my PhD, as you noted, in the early 1980s, 1983, came to Boston University in 1984, and a couple of years after I was at Boston University, I was introduced to the late John Anthony West.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he passed away earlier this year. But I was introduced to him, and he introduced me to the work of Schwaller de Lubitsch, who is very much sort of outside of the mainstream Egyptology camp. Schwaller died in 1961, but among other things, Schwaller, based on the evidence he had accumulated, suggested that Egypt was built on an earlier legacy of civilization. Something earlier had come. The Egyptians themselves talked about that, and Schwaller was the first one to suggest that maybe physical evidence of this could be found in terms of the Sphinx. So I got involved in the late 1980s, first went to Egypt in 1990 to look at the Sphinx up close, firsthand, in real life, as a geologist, because my training, my PhD is geology and geophysics. One of my specialties is looking at weathering and erosion, and the suggestion from John Anthony West and Schwaller de Lubitsch was that the weathering and erosion on the body of the Sphinx is not compatible with the arid, hyper-arid, Sahara desert conditions that we know have existed on the Giza Plateau, where the Sphinx sits with the Great Pyramid and the Second Pyramid. The weathering and erosion is not compatible with desert conditions of the last 5,000 years, and this suggests that the Sphinx, the original Sphinx, goes back to a much, much earlier period. And I went there and I was amazed. I didn't think this could be true, but when I saw it with my own eyes, I realized that what we're looking at with the Sphinx, the body of the Sphinx, is a type of weathering and erosion that's due to rain, to precipitation, to a very different climatic regime than the last 5,000 years. It had to push back the origins of the statue to a much earlier period. So that's really what got me, in a professional way, involved in all of this research and debate over when did civilization begin, have there been earlier civilizations. And I just want to point out, because I like to point this out before I forget, that the head of the Sphinx is a recarving, so it's not the original head. The head of the Sphinx is about 4,500, 5,000 years old, but it's not the original head. The original head was highly eroded and weathered and was recarved. We actually now know, based on evidence just in the last year and a half, that the Sphinx was originally a lioness, a female lion, whom the dynastic Egyptians, the very early dynastic Egyptians, referred to as Mehet, the lioness Mehet, the goddess Mehet.
Oh, and I've heard that where is it fair to say that there was a completely earlier civilization? Now, you're saying that it was recarved. So was there a completely other civilization prior to the one that we're studying in modern history?
Oh, yeah, I believe so. Put it this way, very simplistically, there were civilizations that arose somewhere in the mists of time. We don't know how far back they go, but they were certainly at a very high level of sophistication 12,000 years ago, which is the very end of the last ice age, what we think of as the end of the last ice age, in 9700 BC, and we can date that quite accurately based on Greenland ice cores and other types of data, and I talk about this in my book, Forgotten Civilization. We can date very precisely, certainly within a couple of years, when the last ice age ended. And it ended catastrophically. There were huge climatic changes. This is what people think of, the glaciers melting, that type of thing. I've concluded it was due to a major solar outburst, a major eruption from the sun that hit Earth and caused these devastating changes, which include not just climatic changes, but earthquakes, increased volcanic activity. All of these were related to what was happening, the melting of the glaciers virtually instantaneously, what would have looked like huge thunderbolts hitting the surface of the Earth, causing wildfires, causing what's known as vitrification, the melting of surface rock, and then it recongeals. Melting glaciers, as I said, where it hit large bodies of water, including the oceans. It would have boiled off surface water, if you would. It would have caused, incredible amounts of moisture to go into the atmosphere, which then rained down as torrential rains. And this ties in with the mythologies of torrential rains and rising sea levels and flooding on the surface of the land. And getting back to the Sphinx, it was these torrential rains, I am now convinced, that caused the first major erosional features on the Sphinx. And we can see that right on the body of the Sphinx. So we had this, what I call earlier cycle of civilization that was devastated in 9700 BC. Humanity went into a type of dark age. People are familiar with dark ages from Western history. Western history with the fall of the Roman Empire and a dark age, and then the Middle Ages up until the Renaissance again. But this was much earlier period, a dark age from about 9700 BC for about 6,000 plus years until about 3,000, 3,500 BC, when in several places around the world, in Mesopotamia and Egypt in particular, those two areas, you have civilization re-emerging, and the early dynastic Egyptians, for instance, talked about an earlier civilization, that they were sort of picking up the pieces from an earlier civilization or had sort of learned from that and were now developing their own civilization, but building on that earlier legacy, which included, in some cases, literally reusing, reappropriating physical remains from that earlier period. One of those physical remains being what was a huge statue of a lioness, which was repaired. You can, to this day, see the dynastic repairs to the Sphinx, and the head was recarved, as I mentioned, into a human head rather than a head of a female lion. So they were very explicit about this. We have records going back where the ancient Egyptians talked about this. Something I might as well mention right now is Plato, who talks about Atlantis and records essentially the same story. Well, where did the Atlantis story come from? According to Plato, it came from Solon, the Greek lawgiver, who got it from Egypt when he traveled to Egypt. And I don't worry about where was Atlantis. I'm not worried personally. To me, it's not an issue. Well, was Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, or was it on, some island in the Mediterranean, et cetera? To me, that's not the point. I don't think that's what's important. What's important to me is the dating of the fall of Atlantis, the catastrophic destruction of Atlantis. And when you read Plato, he places the destruction of Atlantis at about 9,000 years before Solon, who was 600 BC, which puts us right back to about 9600 BC, which is within, reasonable margin of error for approximation exactly at the end of the last ice age as we now date it with modern geology. And he's talking about the same thing, the fall, the collapse due to natural calamities of advanced civilization at that time.
Wow. So it's fair to say what I'm getting, what you're saying is that it's fair to say this concept of Atlantis could be a general umbrella term for an advanced civilization in general, not necessarily something living, on the Atlantic Ocean and sunk to the bottom of the sea, but that there was, like you said, an advanced civilization that was hit by cataclysm, and we're just seeing now the evidence, or I guess we're just now discovering the evidence that a lot of these older sites are just being rebuilt.
Mm-hmm. That is, I can't talk. That is exactly what I'm saying. That really, in my opinion, the story of Atlantis is referring to this earlier civilization, or this earlier period of advanced societies and civilization, and we are now finding physical evidence of this, really solid evidence that this was the case, and that there was this devastation at what geologists call the end of the last ice age, where you had these cataclysmic changes. And not illogically, the people living at that time, they were devastated by this. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Not just the Sphinx was, not only is the Sphinx evidence of this earlier period and then was reused, but I believe there are other structures in Egypt that we can date back their origins to this earlier period, probably including the positions of the pyramids on the Giza Plateau themselves. We have, though, something that is really outstanding, and I think really puts the evidence forward that undeniably, and that is a site in southeastern Turkey known as Göbekli Tepe, yes, which is an incredible site, incredibly sophisticated, consists of these huge stone pillars, beautifully carved, arranged in circles, sort of Stonehenge-like, but much more sophisticated than Stonehenge, and has all kinds of sculptures associated with it, and incredible little beadwork and done in very hard stones, etc. Just an incredible site. But what's more incredible than anything else to the mainstream archaeologists and to myself when I first went there and first had a chance to explore it and visit it is the dating on it. It dates back to the same early period. It spans the end of the last ice age. And furthermore, it not only it spans it, but it also has evidence of catastrophe there. Literally at Göbekli Tepe, we can reconstruct how the pillars were being knocked down, I'm certain, by the catastrophes of the time. The people were trying to rebuild it, et cetera, and eventually they purposefully covered it over. Apparently, I would speculate maybe to preserve it, maybe they intended to come back to it, maybe just as a time capsule, if you would, for the future generations. We really don't know. But it definitely goes back to this earlier period, and it shows evidence of the cataclysm at that earlier period. And there's no doubt about Göbekli Tepe. It was being excavated by the late Klaus Schmidt, Herr Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, who unfortunately died prematurely. And it's still being studied, of course, by the German Archaeological Institute and the Turkish authorities, the Turkish archaeologists. So it's not something that, there's any question about its dating or its authenticity. It's absolutely real, absolutely dated to this very early period.
I find it fascinating, and I wonder if you have any speculation or any evidence. They say that humanity is 2 million years old, or the humans have been on the planet for 2 million. How old have you seen, or have you researched that there's a sign of civilization?
How far back does civilization go?
Yeah, how far back has any of the ruins shown us, perhaps?
I'm sorry? Say that again?
How far back do some of these ruins or these sites show us that there was somewhat of an advanced civilization?
Yeah, we don't really know. I'm not going to answer if I don't feel I have a good answer. But what I will say to you is that it gets into the issue of how do you recognize civilization in the archaeological record, in the fossil record, in the physical geological record. And if you think about it, so much of our civilization, give it a few thousand years or a few tens of thousands of years, and it's not going to survive. We are right now very, very dependent on electronics, and so much of our information, so much of our knowledge is stored in electronics. That won't survive.
Hold that thought, Robert. We are coming up on a commercial break, and we'll be right back after this message with Dr. Robert Schoch. And welcome back to the Just Bernard Show here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com and revolution.radio. You're listening to the Just Bernard Show on Studio A. We broadcast every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And as you heard on the break, we are the #1 listener-supported radio station. So if you can, head on over to freedomslips.com and make a small contribution or a large contribution. Donate to keep these wonderful programs on the air. As well as, if you appreciate the work that I do and the Just Bernard Show, you can head over to patreon.com/Bernard Alvarez and become a patron for as little as $2 a month. With that, you will receive special patron-only VIP exclusive content, classes, and other wonderful information and broadcasts that you normally would not get. So without further ado, let me welcome back Robert Schoch to today's show. Robert, you were talking about, and which is funny because it's on my mind a lot, that we do save our information on these electronic discs, and what happens, or not even these electronic devices, how are people going to find it in the future if something happens to us,
Yeah, exactly. We just don't know, and we don't know what to look for in some cases when we're searching for ancient civilizations in the remote past. Again, I was using the analogy before the break that so much of our civilization is encoded in electronics, for instance. So much of our civilization before the electronics, of course, was on paper books. How long will they last? Given the normal geology that progresses. When I say normal geology, I'm a geologist. I think in terms of sometimes millions of years, tens of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years or more. Very few things are preserved, and it's a rule of thumb that as you go back further in the past, what gets preserved drops off logarithmically. So the chances of finding these earlier civilizations, we don't want to stop looking, but they're not going to be as obvious as some people think they would be.
Yeah, and exactly that. I mean, these ancient civilizations, they built these monoliths and megaliths, and everything was literally carved in stone. So, and not to mention, that's all we can see. What's that?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Some of those civilizations did, and the ones that where something survives are the ones that were megalithic builders, and we have lots of evidence for that at the end of the last ice age and potentially earlier. And this gets into another point that we really should emphasize, is that many of these major stone structures, we don't really know how far back they go, because we find evidence, for instance, that they were used 5,000 years ago, but that doesn't mean they originated 5,000 years ago, because just like my work on the Sphinx, we can speculate and then find evidence in many cases that they actually go back much earlier. They were being reused, say, 5,000 years ago. Now, 12,000 years ago, were they being reused again? Could some of them go back much earlier? So stone is one thing. I'm a geologist. Maybe I'm particularly enamored with stone structures, but stone structures do tend to last versus other types of structures. But what about a civilization, an advanced civilization that's not building with stone primarily, is not preserving things by carving into stone? What survives from that civilization?
Yeah, exactly. And I can't help but wonder, and I know this might be a little far-fetched, but who knows? I can't help but wonder if there's other information for these older civilizations that have been recorded in a way that maybe perhaps we don't understand, the way someone may not be able to understand how to use a flash drive. Is there information in crystals? Is there information in stone? Is there information recorded somewhere that we just haven't figured out yet? And I'm guessing that's going to happen.
I think that's a very good point, very good question. It's old-fashioned now to my students, because I teach college at Boston University, but I'll use the term old-fashioned DVDs and CDs. Well, people still use them, but think about how much information you can put onto a DVD. Then think about a little flash drive, a little thumb drive, as they call them, and how much information can be put on some of those. I mean, it's incredible. We're talking orders of magnitude more in something that's smaller and smaller. So, but,
maybe there is something out there.
Now, if we go through a catastrophe in another dark age, 10,000 years from now, someone finds the remains of a DVD or a flash drive, they're not going to know what that is. And how can they imagine that the equivalent of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books is on that?
It's true.
So, it's a lot we don't know. I wanted to also make the point that we have information coming down, and I always want physical evidence. So I am very much a physical scientist, and I want physical evidence to support and back things up. But that being said, I don't believe we should ignore traditional myths and legends. We were talking about Atlantis before, but there are lots of myths and legends that talk about earlier periods, earlier civilizations. There have been comparative studies of mythology that show that many of these myths and legends around the world have more pieces in common, more commonalities than you would ever expect just by coincidence if they were all made up independent of each other. So I think we also need to look at work along those lines, some of which suggest that many of these common stories, if you would, go back tens of thousands of years, again, to an earlier, core, sophisticated, I'll use the term, civilization, or at least advanced society.
Yes, and the first thing that comes to mind are these pyramid cultures that they supposedly have popped up spontaneously around the planet. I don't know if they were the same time, but how does information like that travel around the world if it wasn't common knowledge, or if they weren't communicating and advanced enough to communicate with each other, I wonder.
Oh, yeah, and this is something I actually wrote a book called Voyages of the Pyramid Builders,
yes.
Some years ago, and something I was looking at that time was this very question, and I remain convinced that in ancient times there was a lot more interchange, both physical interchange, people traveling around the world, or at least across oceans, and ideas and concepts, technologies being exchanged over long distances, both long distances on land and also, as I said, across oceans, both across the Pacific and the Atlantic. When I was an undergraduate at George Washington University, if you even talked about, in an academic sense, interchange between the old world and the new world before Columbus, people laughed if you said it on an exam or paper, you got an F.
Mm-hmm.
We now know that there is evidence for that. The mainstream still does not acknowledge, I believe, the level of evidence and how far back it goes, but at least there's progress being made there.
And, speaking of, and actually somebody is asking a question, I have it on my mind as well, speaking of how old these civilizations are, I don't know if you mentioned it and I missed it, but were you able to date the age of the Sphinx, and what's the idea or your thought on the age of the Sphinx and when it was created?
Yeah, no, my best estimate for the Sphinx right now is that it goes back to at least about 10,000 BC. I talk about this in the Origins of the Sphinx, my book, Origins of the Sphinx, co-authored with Robert Bouval, that came out relatively recently. And I think it goes back at least to 10,000 BC, the core body of the Sphinx. As I said, the head is recarved. So this is a huge discrepancy from what the Egyptologists say, which is that the Sphinx was carved from scratch from the bedrock in 2500 BC. So they're talking 2500 BC approximately. I'm talking about 10,000 BC or even earlier, because I cannot dismiss the evidence. Let me start over. I cannot dismiss the notion based on evidence that the Sphinx couldn't be earlier. One of the things that we're looking at, or at least as I see it, is that you have high civilization, sophisticated societies at the end of the last ice age. I don't think this just happened overnight. They didn't just pop up overnight. So I think they have a long history building up to that before they were devastated by the end of the last ice age. But how long that history is, how far back they go, I don't know at this point. There's evidence at Göbekli Tepe, at least Klaus Schmidt was talking about this before his untimely death, that Göbekli Tepe is a huge site. This is a site in southeastern Turkey. Most of it has yet to be excavated, but as he was starting to excavate other portions of it, he was talking about some of it goes back thousands of years prior to 10,000 BC, as I understood it. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So we just don't know how far back it goes. Then sometimes people bring up, other species even. For instance, Neanderthals, and how sophisticated were they? In reality, since the late 19th, early 20th century, people have always seen these other species, other than Homo sapiens, as being brutish and crude and sort of ape-like, but that's probably just a stereotype. There's more and more evidence to suggest that they were incredibly sophisticated in their own right, but they weren't necessarily making tangible physical entities. They weren't building, for instance, megalithic structures that have survived. So again, it gets into the problem of what does a civilization do, what does a people do that survives into the present day.
And speaking of surviving and things that are just being rediscovered, we hear a lot about the Sphinx and the mysteries of the Sphinx, and perhaps that there was a hidden chamber underneath. Have you looked into that?
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, here's another issue. When I was working on the Sphinx in the early 1990s, and I continued to work on the Sphinx, something that I did in conjunction with geophysicist Thomas DeBecke is we carried out seismic studies around the base of the Sphinx. I wanted to look at subsurface weathering patterns, basically mineralogical changes due to exposure of the rock once it was carved down, etc., without going into a lot of detail. Again, I talk about this in great detail in Origins of the Sphinx if people are interested. But we found other things, and one thing we found was a chamber under the left paw of the Sphinx. So I believe what you're talking about, you're now speaking to the person who discovered that. Thomas DeBecke and I discovered that together with the seismic studies. And there had been some suggestions before based on some geophysics that maybe there was some kind of cavity there. A lot of people had suggested it based on other evidence, should we say, most notably, and I did not know this at the time, but most notably the great late psychic Edgar Cayce had said that there was some kind of chamber under or near the paws of the Sphinx. I did not know about that when we did this work. I'd heard of Edgar Cayce, and that was about it. I didn't know anything about his theories connected with Atlantis or the Sphinx. But lo and behold, he had said decades earlier, I mean, he was long deceased when we did this work. He had said in one of his trance states, he was a sleeping prophet, and when he was in one of these sleeping trance states, he had talked about the Hall of Records of Atlanteans being located in the vicinity of the paws of the Sphinx. In fact, depending on your interpretation, he talks about it being on the right side, which it is if you face the Sphinx. It's under the Sphinx's left paw, but if you face the Sphinx, that's on the right side. And he talks about this. Now, fast forward decades, just recently, my colleague, Dr. Manu Safzadeh, discovered, and then we developed this further and wrote a paper on it, along with Robert Bauval, that the Sphinx was originally a lioness Mephit, and not only was she a lioness Mephit according to the earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions, but she guards a chamber underneath. Tie that back to the chamber that we found. I believe that that is the chamber that we found, and we have now very early hieroglyphic inscriptions indicating that the Egyptians knew this 5,000 or so years ago, that under the Sphinx, what we now call the Sphinx, at that time was a lioness Mephit, the goddess rendition of the goddess Mephit, guarding a chamber underneath, which they referred to as an archive, a royal archive, more or less. Another term would be a hall of records. So it's there. Yeah. I have no doubt it's there. We have the geophysical evidence. We have the textual evidence from the hieroglyphics. Now we just need to raise money and convince the Egyptian authorities to probe it directly and explore it, which is something I'd like do. So if someone would like to donate a few $1,000,000, we could get this started.
And that was going to be my next
I
question.
I joke not.
I support your raising funds for it. Absolutely. I was going to say if they would have let you in already, but I guess that answers my question. So
no, that answers the question. But something that I had a lot of resistance. Well, someone who gave me a lot of resistance for many years was Dr. Zai Hawass. And I get along with him personally, but I understand the politics of Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. But there have been, as sometimes people like to say in America, regime changes. There's maybe a different tenor in Egypt now, so I'm hopeful that maybe soon we'll be able to continue this important research, because who knows what's in that archive, that chamber, what kind of records might still exist in it that could be not only of incredible interest, but actually useful and important.
Oh, most certainly.
I sometimes compare it to Tutankhamun. People may not remembered personally, but know about the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. It was a huge sensation.
Yeah.
Close to 100 years ago. Well, I think we could have something just as big here.
Absolutely, and especially, I mean, who was it that burned down the Library of Alexandria, Caesar or whatnot?
Oh, it was burnt down. It was burnt down several times, but finally the Christians put an end to the whole thing in the 4th century.
Unfortunately, and imagine all the information we lost there and what might be found,
exactly.
What could be rediscovered.
There could be at least some of it in there. So I think these things are very important to pursue for the world and as well as for Egyptology. I have no animosity towards Egyptology and Egyptologists per se. In fact, I love Egypt and
it's a one. Well, I mean,
Egypt.
To me, I've always been fascinated by Egypt, even as a child. And I won't go into any of my stories, but I've just always felt a calling to. Maybe it's an informational thing that I've always been drawn to. But I wonder if, speaking of the Sphinx and staying on the Sphinx, that when they said that it was dug out of the bedrock, it kind of looks like there's a moat or something around it. What were your thoughts on the Sphinx and the moat?
It's not a moat.
Okay.
It's not a moat at all. It was carved out of the bedrock. I'll be blunt. Some people have suggested there was a moat around the Sphinx. They've tried to use this to explain the water weathering. They've even suggested it was Anubis with his head sticking up out of a pool of water around him. When you actually go there and look at it, it couldn't hold water like that. The rock, the geology doesn't allow it. It's a very porous in some ways limestone. You have karst features, that type of thing, if that means anything to most people. I'm using some technical terms here, but basically it's a very, on the one hand, it's a very nice limestone, very good solid limestone, but it does develop underground, I should say, cave-type features and channels. So to think that this somehow held water all around, and that would also not produce the weathering features that we have on the Sphinx today. One thing, and this will maybe be a simple way to put it, if you filled this with water, how do you fill it with water? You fill it from the bottom up. You would flood it in from the Nile. If you're flooding it in from the Nile with rising water levels, that will undercut the lower layers to a much greater degree than you see in real life on the plateau. It would give a different type of weathering profile. What we see is a weathering profile which is from water runoff from above, from precipitation, from rainfall, from flash floods coming from higher up on the plateau. So it's a very different geology, and once you understand the geology, it makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I mean, it's easy for someone to say, oh, it was a moat, and that explains everything. And if someone doesn't really know the Sphinx in detail, has never actually been there, or didn't know what they were looking at when they were there, and doesn't know any geology, it sort of sounds reasonable, but it's really not.
So it's fair to say that we need to start wrapping up, but it's fair to say that I don't want to say we need to question everything, but perhaps it's time for us to start looking at alternatives and start being open to new research and not say history is carved in stone without making a pun. But we seem to be learning quite a bit more, aren't we?
Oh, I think we're learning a lot more. I think we're undergoing potentially a revolution in our thinking about the origins of civilization and how many civilizations there have been in the past, or what I call cycles of civilization that goes back much earlier, what causes civilizations to collapse, the demise of civilizations, the reemergence of civilizations. These are things that I'm very much involved with, and I think are incredibly important because they reflect back on our own civilization and what we might be facing in the future. Those early civilizations were devastated by natural catastrophes, in particular the solar outburst. And if I could put it, because I know we have to wrap up here, could I mention my website, please?
Oh, yes, by all means.
Yeah, please, people should go to my website, Robert Schoch, and Schoch is spelled S-C-H-O-C-H, so one word, Robert Schoch, ROBERTSCHOCH.com. And when they go there, there's a very good summary article, which they'll see a link to from the home page, the front page, on SIDA, Solar-Induced Dark Age, which gives an overview of much of what we've been talking about, which is really a very different view of the origins of civilization, the rise of civilization, demise, and reemergence of civilization. So I suggest that for a good overview. Also, I want to point out that I will be speaking next month at Portal to Ascension Conference, and that's, where is that? That's in Irvine, California. Yeah, and that is the 5th to the 7th of October next month, and I would love people to be able to come to that. I will be speaking about all these topics in more length, and we'll take questions. I love interacting with people personally. My wife and I will be there.
Oh,
and then finally, we've been talking about Egypt, and there's a link from my webpage to the Portal of Ascension conferences. Go under, I think it's under Appearances. And furthermore, if people would like to see Egypt for themselves, or maybe revisit Egypt if they've already been there, that's great too. So many people, they go to Egypt and then they have to go back and they have to go back again because it's just an incredible place. And you always see something new, even when you go to the same sites. I've known people who have gone on to the same sites, a tour to the same sites 3 or 4 times, but they always see something new. And I mean, I've been to Egypt, I don't know how many times, and I always see something new, even at a site I've visited a dozen or more times before. But I will be co-leading a tour to Egypt in June of 2019. And this is for the Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures, which is a nonprofit organization. I'm a co-founder of it, but with other colleagues. And we're doing a tour through the nonprofit Oracle, O-R-A-C-U-L, which again stands for Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures. And that will be June 2019. Again, if people go to my website, robertschoch.com, S-C-H-O-C-H, robertschoch.com, there's a link to the Oracle Egypt trip.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, I would love to do something like that someday. I got a busy year next year, but I would love to do that.
Oh, it would be wonderful. It would be wonderful.
Yes, it really, really would. So again, that's for Oracle, and that'll be June 2019. And Robert, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and bringing us so much more information, reigniting our interest in these ancient cultures and reminding us of what's so special about these sites and what we can learn from our history. And hopefully we'll learn things that will, so we don't end up with another cataclysm, or at least not a man-made one. But
Exactly.
Perhaps, but that would be wonderful. So thank you so much. And before we wrap up, of course, I do want to remind everyone that I will be speaking at the Spirit Heart Conference, and that'll be September of 2019. And we'll be heading down to the Virgin Islands. It's a 7-day cruise on the Harmony of the Seas. I will be speaking of the work that is in my book, The Book of One. We'll talk about the awakening of humanity. And so many other speakers will be joining me as well. It's going to be, I believe it's 20 other speakers. Miriam Delicato may be one of them. And, of course, dozens more. And you can go to spiritheartcruise.weebly.com. I'll post more information on that. And then next week, of course, we're going to be doing a consciousness talk. It'll be the third week of September already. My goodness. But anyway, so Robert, is there any last thing that you think civilization would like to hear or needs to hear?
Well, I think civilization needs to hear that we need to look at the ancient civilizations seriously, see what we can learn from them, both positively and negatively, and we need to take that to heart. And again, much more on my website, Robert Schoch, RobertSchoch.com.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Rob. We look forward to seeing you and hearing you at the Portal to Ascension Conference, and we'll hear from you again soon. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Have a great week. Bye-bye, everyone.